Chapter 5, Parts 1 and 2. Chapter 5, The Battle of Victory Bay. Part 1, The Battle of Victory Bay saw two unconventional, some say heretical alliances come into play. First to form was the one clearly disfavored by him on Holy Terror. The treacherous and despicable Eldar made common cause with the subversive and opportunistic Tau. Against them stood an amalgamation of the Emperor's own Astartes, the valiant Imperial Guard led by General Militant Lucas Alexander, surviving PDF regiments and various Adeptus Mechanicus assets who received aid from an unexpected corner. A xeno-species that had called Kronus its home for countless centuries and slumbered for eons below the surface. I'm speaking about no other but the enigmatic and dangerous Necrons, who were little more than rumors to the Imperium at large during those days. The details around the formation of the tenuous alliance remain obscured to this day. However, one thing is clear. It formed shortly after the Tau and Eldar struck their own compact, perhaps as a direct answer to the changed strategic situation on the surface. While there was no doubt in the valor, faith and discipline of the Imperial defenders, there simply weren't enough of them to fight and win against 5 different armies, especially when they were cut off from the Imperium at large and thus a source of reinforcements and resupply. The Imperial Guard and Space Marines already met an Orc horde in open combat and vanquished it, suffering moderate casualties in the process, only for the despicable Tau to strike at their weakened lines in the Guard's moment of triumph. While that treacherous attack was repulsed with heavy Xeno casualties, it served as a stark reminder that the war for Kronus was far from over, and in fact it would only grow harder from then on. This led the Imperial defenders to craft even more extensive defensive positions in and around Victory Bay and its surrounding areas. When the Xeno assault came, it smashed Aircy Trait into the Imperial defenses. A Century of War, biography of General Militant Lucas Alexander. 10th edition, published 995 Men 40, Cadia, Victory Bay. How a species so crude and primitive, like the Mon Ki, managed to claw its way to be the currently dominant one in the galaxy, Farseer Taldir would never know. Those beasts were not only foolish and ugly, they were blind and deaf as well. While in this instance those traits worked to her benefit, she couldn't get over the fact that these things were an actual credible threat to the Eldar as a whole. That simply underscored how far her people had fallen and how important it was that they retake their rightful place as the undisputed rulers of the galaxy. Through sorcery, high technology, and naturally superior skill, the Eldar under Taldir's command managed to slip multiple strike teams through the crude and porous Mon Ki defensive lines. The worshippers of the corpse god had dug in deep enough that a headlong charge in their guns would have been folly even for superior Eldar warriors. However, that was really of no consequence. Why face them head-on, when slipping behind their backs and slamming a poisoned blade in their heart was trivial, especially when the Tau were around to act as a distraction? The only unanticipated development so far was the presence of cloaked Jungier drones, which weren't up to the task of properly evading the Eldar's senses. It was obvious that the old enemy would be keeping a close eye on the slaughter upon to unfold and alter its tactics accordingly. Ideally, Taldir would have struck at the Necrons earlier. However, with Chaos presence on the planet in increasing strength, the crippled soulless machines had to wait before falling under the blades of the Eldar. A litany of psychic messages bombarded the Farseer. Stealth specialists were in place or ready to teleport in and strike, with other forces that were less adept at sneaking around, keeping to ground before charging at the sound of the guns. Rangers had picked up enemy officers to assassinate. Warp spiders were ready to deploy and shred infantry, so they could clear the way for other aspect warriors to butcher the Mon Ki artillery. Tanks, weapon platforms, and air assets attached as escorts waited to dash in, just beyond detection range from the human defenses, and they would do so the moment the Tau offered themselves as distraction. Taldir herself led a party of banshees and various hand-picked warriors through what passed for human architecture, relying on her own gifts and those of her comrades to keep them out of sight as they advanced towards the Mon Ki command center. She would see to it herself that Lucas Alexander would never again attempt to meddle into the affairs of his betters. It was as she foresaw it The Tau took longer than originally anticipated to muster for this all-out assault, which honestly was to be expected. No one in the whole galaxy could move with the speed and grace of the Eldar, which was one of her people's defining traits. They were without a peer not only at small tactical scale, but army-wide as well, something unfortunately Taldir lacked the assets to properly demonstrate on Kronus. Otherwise she wouldn't have needed to use such blunt instruments like orcs and Tau. Primitive railguns cracked in the distance, followed by missiles, both Eldar and Tau alike. Just like in her visions, those weapons bathed the Mon-Ki in cleansing flames, removing the stain of their existence from the face of this world. Armored spearheads converged on previously identified weak points in the Imperial defenses, and it all happened just in time. Taldir turned around the corner of a particularly ugly Mon-Ki dwelling and laid her eyes upon the enemy command center. "Strike them down," the Farseer sang, her psychically enchanted voice carrying all over Victory Bay. At that point, reality decided it was time to do its own thing and go off the rails set up by Taldir's visions. Squads of Necron warriors materialized all over the region among localized lighting storms. Larger units tore their way from the ground or drove through buildings where they were concealed. Despite the danger of the warp storm pressing upon Kronus, Astartes Terminators teleported from their ships in orbit, while others came from the sky riding rocket packs. Taldir herself had no time to rage at the impossibility of the Jungir allying with anyone, much less the humans, when the truth stared her in the face. Two of the Mon-Ki dreadnoughts walked through the walls of the command center, while a Necron lord strode through the entrance and levered its staff in her direction. There would be time for recriminations and trying to figure out how her visions misled her so badly later. Now it was time to fight and kill. They were Eldar. No one could stand against them. "You think you have us trapped?" Taldir sneered. "Think again." With those words, she unleashed her psychic might upon the Jungir leader and the Mon-Ki in his vicinity. The Eldar warriors wasted no time and scattered, slamming into their would-be ambushers with predictably bloody results. Eldar were never to be underestimated. That was one of the first things they taught us in the Schola. We had them where we wanted them, spread thin at a time and place of our own choosing. We had the numbers, we had the firepower, and we had the element of surprise, even if none of the sneaky bastards was obliging enough to walk into the kill zone when the assault began. It didn't help that the two Astartes dreadnoughts, painstakingly smuggled into the command center, jumped the gun before we could open fire. That short delay proved fatal for all too many guardsmen. In a blink of an eye, the Eldar scattered, some teleporting, others moving so fast they were hard to follow blur. The Banshees unleashed their screams, and even with ear protections, the psychic component clawed at everyone's minds. "Fire! For the Emperor! Kill the Eldar!" I screamed at the top of my lungs while calling on the powers of the warp to enhance my body. The Space Marines were first to recover and open fire, followed by Karskins and veteran guardsmen. Devastator squads laid down murderous suppressive fire, while tactical Marines focused their fire upon the nimble enemy to bring them down faster. A warp spider materialized upon a gargoyle, learning at the street below us, aiming 2 pistols my way. Before it could shred me, Antaeus blasted it away, along with the ugly statue with a concentrated stream of warp-delivered lighting. "The Emperor protects," the librarian roared, hefting his thunderhammer. It was pure bloody madness from then on. Part 2, Victory Bay, Kronus. It was one thing to hear the stories about the pointy-eared Xenos, it was something else entirely to face them in combat. Sergeant Gabriel Forcus learned that lesson the hard way. One moment he was hiding within the interior of a living room on the 10th floor of a residential complex, taking care to keep himself away from the windows. He was with a heavy weapons section, who had a multi-laser deployed and ready to be pushed to the balcony overlooking the avenue below so it could do its lethal work. The place was very pleasant, much better furnished than anything someone from his family could even dream of back on his home hive, at least before he made the cut and not only joined the Imperial Guard but qualified for the Commandos. Nowadays, he sent a large portion of his salary their way, and it might have improved his family's fortunes. However, he was unlikely to see it for himself, barring a disaster at home calling for the deployment of the Guard there, or Gabriel having the good fortune of living to retirement. All things considered, if he lived long enough to retire, he would have much preferred to do it on a nice civilized world like Kronus instead of a bloody hive. That, of course, was before Phorcus knew that a veritable list of who's who of the Imperium's enemies would descend upon this poor world while his regiment was stationed there. Crown actual to all elements, we have hard contact. Follow contingency Alpha. The general's voice cracked over the vox built in Gabriel's sealed helmet. Moments later, a commotion happened outside, and he heard the Inquisitor ordering them to execute the ambush. Immediately it became painfully obvious that their portion of overall plan had already went to hell. Before any of the commandos could reach the windows, a lithe armored figure materialized in front of them. Phorcus didn't think, he simply acted, countless hours of training kicking in, and dove for the ground while triggering his hellgun. The only reason he survived the initial onslaught was because the Xeno concentrated on the larger threat. It used dual pistols to literally shred Gabriel's buddies and paint the room red with their blood, then it simply vanished again, before the sergeant could avenge his comrades. The commando didn't waste any time on curses or regrets, instead he rolled around, retrieved a grenade from his harness and threw it in the middle of the room before dashing for the door. After what just happened, going to the balcony was going to be suicide for no good gain. With his back covered for a moment, he had a choice to make. Go low and either cover left or right if the damn Xeno waited for him in the corridor. Gabriel chose right and rolled through the door spraying laser fire. No alien materialized to turn him into ribbons, which was a small blessing. His comrades outside and in the rest of the building weren't so lucky. The sergeant could clearly hear human and alien screams that were almost lost under the thunder of weapons fire. Phorcus got away from the door just in time to avoid being perforated by shrapnel from his own grenade and sprinted to the closest friendly position to reinforce it. After what he just saw, he had no illusions about trying to face the aliens one-on-one. Unfortunately, the Xeno had other ideas. Gabriel sensed something and ducked, somehow managing to avoid a kick aimed at his head. The alien made an impossible twist in the air and landed on the wall. It leered at him through the glowing eyes of its helmet and aimed its pistols at him. Phorcus knew it was futile, yet he tried to bring his hellgun up to spray the bastard. Instead of meeting an inglorious death then and there, the sergeant had the privilege of seeing the ceiling going down and at least a ton of Astartes land upon the fucking Xeno. The floor didn't appreciate the abuse and collapsed under the impact with almighty crash, thus leaving Gabriel to stare at the resulting hole like a drooling imbecile. I was going to be perfectly content to keep to the high ground and take pot shots at the Eldar with a borrowed hellgun, while the Astartes, Necrons, and the Guard overwhelmed the Eldar. It was a good plan, it was safe plan, it was the sane thing to do too. Said plan went out of the shattered window shortly after Antaeus jumped through, surrounded by a halo of psychic power, so he could get close and personal with the Eldar. From the kitchen we hid in, I had a front row seat of the aliens in action, and after seeing them, I had no intention of going anywhere near the bastards. One of the shrieking female ones, a banshee, blurred straight into a third-room apartment across the street, and in the time it took me to raise my weapon and aim, while still trying to enhance myself with warp energy, she butchered a whole squad of veteran soldiers, made it look pathetically easy even. She danced almost faster than the eye could track, practically leaving an afterimage, which was the only thing the quickest guardsman managed to hit before she took his head off with a swipe of her curved blade. I just managed to take aim when a burning sphere barely missed my head, making me flinch and ruining the shot. Without thinking, I dove through the window, hoping beyond hope that the arcane energies running through me would be enough to keep me alive upon hitting the ground. That was the prudent thing to do too, because a moment later my hiding hole transformed into an inferno thanks to the plasma grenade. I landed hard on my feet and felt my bones protest the impact. However, I didn't think I managed to broke anything. At any rate, I didn't have time for such trivial concerns like shattered bones. Another of the banshees was nearby, busying herself with dismantling a pair of Ogrin. She had one of the poor bastards hamstrung, his arms hung limply to his side, and he stared dumbly at his opened belly. The crazy bitch was busy repeating the performance with his friend when I sent a burst of hellgun fire at her back. She sensed something because she twisted even as I was pressing the trigger and actually managed to throw off my aim, just enough so 2 of the 3 shots missed. The last one caught her in the shoulder blade. It boiled a chunk of her armor, and by the way she shrieked, that had to sting. However, the wound didn't slow her down much, and she headed my way, well tried anyway. A paw of a hand grabbed her knee and she stumbled, managing to drag the second Ogrin with her. She screamed pure murder and twisted around, severing the arm at the wrist, and slammed her blade in the trooper's throat. That gave me more than enough time to send 2 bursts in her back, and this time there was no avoiding them. Her armor ablated and boiled away from the first 3 shots, and the second burst struck unprotected flesh. The Eldar bitch collapsed, however I shot her 2 more times just to make sure before sprinting to the nearest available cover. That was when my personal plans about this battle went totally off the rails. I managed to get behind an abandoned ground car without anyone else trying to murder me, and saw and felt the Farseer unleash a storm of psychic energy at the command center and the Necron who had came out to face her. I also saw a small, thin figure run out of a building down street, followed by alien fire that shredded the ground just behind its heels. It took me a moment to wrap my head around what I was seeing. That was the same lass we recovered when we went to save Requista. She was supposed to be safe under guard, not anywhere near the fighting. One of the banshees jumped through a window to land in front of the girl, and I was sure I would see the child die before I could shoot the alien bitch. Instead, the Eldar stumbled as if she was drunk, and her well-aimed strike turned into a crude swing that missed by miles. I shot the banshee in the back before she could recover, and was glad to see her go down like my first target. "Over here," I shouted at the girl, who continued to run, her wide, terrified eyes darting every which way, though I wasn't sure she was seeing anything in her panic, nor caring about a thing besides getting as far away from the fighting as she could. An Eldar teleported behind her, and he stumbled too before he could aim his 2 pistols at her. I shot him in the chest for his trouble, however his heavier armor absorbed the las bolts, merely causing him to stagger as parts of the chest plate ablated away. Seeing no other good option, I continued to shoot at the bastard, who vanished after I hit him a second time. I felt a presence materializing behind me and knew that there was no way I could turn around fast enough to matter. All I had was the warp energy I was using to bring my body's performance closer to the capabilities of the aliens, and what I did was a damn foolish idea under the best of circumstances. I released all the psychic energy I was channeling as a crude blast wave behind me. Just the backslash brought me to my knees and felt like someone just took a warhammer to my brain. As if that wasn't enough, with my concentration gone to hell, I could feel something clawing at my mind, trying to find purchase. Something laughed and hissed at me in a language that wasn't just wrong, but it hurt to hear. It felt as if pressed clawed fingers at my skull and began slowly pushing them in, enjoying every moment of it. I tried to slap it away, pushed at it with everything I had, and it only laughed harder, amused by my feeble efforts. Then it was suddenly gone, and the warp with it. I was on my back, staring at smoke-chocked skies, and I could hear someone wailing nearby. Small, cold fingers touched my face, bringing my attention to a slim figure kneeling at my side. The girl was beside me. She was babbling something I couldn't hear and trying to get my attention. The hell just happened, and what was that infernal sound? I managed to turn my head to the right and saw that teleporting bastard of an Eldar curled in a fetal position, wailing as if a horde of demons were having their wicked way with him. Chapter 5, Parts 3 Atom 4. Chapter 5, The Battle of Victory Bay. Part 3, Victory Bay. Kronus. This could have gone better, the Necron Lord decided. He was stuck in the epicenter of a small, localized and unpleasantly potent psychic storm. He had to brace himself, even slam his staff into the ground for a better purchase and channel as much energy as he could into stabilizing reality around him. The psychic phenomena tore apart the human command center behind him, which was emptied of anything but a bare-bones staff meant to help sell the illusion it was still a prime strategic target. Those humans were now either dead or running for their lives. The 2 machines that hid along with him in anticipation for the Aeldari assault weren't fast and agile enough to flee. They were too close to the epicenter to make it anyway. The so-called dreadnought on the left took the brunt of the storm, It broke through its heavy plating with ease and tore the soul of its crippled pilot to shreds. The second machine was more fortunate. While it lost its left arm and the flamer attached to it, it managed to stumble into the reality-enforced zone near the Necron before the storm turned it into a pile of useless scarp. That was a foolish thing to do. The machine rumbled humbly, smoke rose from its chassis, even as rivulets of molten metal slid down deep gorges, blasted into the armor. At that moment, the Necron Lord really wished he could have voiced his agreement. The standard Necron units lacked working voice casters. Those in storage were little more than scrap, and the data on building them was either gone, or it would take days, if not weeks, to be recovered, if at all possible. He lacked the know-how to put to good use a human voxcaster, though if things went well enough, he might get something working on that front in the future. Relying on that transformed human as a voice was less than ideal if the reactions of the other humans during the brief meetings between the two sides were anything to go by. The Necron Lord checked the feedback from his deployed forces and lamented the fact that he was still largely crippled, otherwise he wouldn't have been stuck tanking the Eldar attack. It was almost a frustrating thing to experience. At least the other parts of the battle were going better. A pair of destroyers with infantry hanging off their backs emerged from the ground right behind an Eldari raiding party. The Guardians and Aspect warriors were too busy enjoying themselves slaughtering the human infantry support of an artillery position to pay attention, and by the time they sensed the danger, half of them died due to overlapping Gauss blasts. The rest scattered and found themselves fighting for their lives as the humans rallied and charged them as well. A ranger squad perched on the top floor of a building took aim at their targets, yet before they could decapitate the leadership of a dug-in infantry company, a pair of wraiths detached from a transport flying above crashed through the building and engaged them in close-quarters combat. 2 units of line infantry, whose reliability the Lord doubted, found themselves engaging a large group of fire dragons advancing towards the human armored reserve. That blocking force wasn't enough to stop the Eldari by themselves. However, the time it took the enemy to turn them all into molten slag was more than enough for human artillery to zero in on the fire dragoons and erase the whole grid with a massive sustained barrage. Finally, the psychic storm subdued, and the Necron Lord wasted no time in teleporting away. Relishing in the fact that the power transmission between the working reactors in his base and his form was one of the few things still working. He materialized behind the Farseer, who was already ducking and rolling to avoid his attack. The Necron merely sent a blast of Gauss energy her way to keep her honest, if that was at all possible, and slung his staff around, while channeling and discharging as much energy as he could through it. One of the screeching banshees acting as honor guards managed to get away just in time, merely having her armor scorched. The second one, who was closer, was much less fortunate. She managed an impossible twist and turn, avoiding a proper strike from the staff, which merely grazed her foot. That and the corona of power surrounding it was more than enough to vaporize her armor, burn her whole leg to a charred ruin before the Gauss energy got to work flaying the rest of her. One of the Eldari phasing specialists popped up nearby and opened fire with his shuriken pistols. Those things were lethal to lightly armored targets, like most of the Necron's new allies. Against the heavy plating protecting their lord, most shots glanced harmlessly away thanks to the energies running through and just above the necrodermis, which greatly increased its already substantial durability. The Necron Lord waved a hand at the offending warp spider, the motion releasing a crescent of emerald energy. The Eldari phased out only to appear behind the Necron. He managed a single burst before a human sniper hit him in the side, sending him spilling on the ground. The warp spider teleported away by reflex, and his luck ran out. It appeared right in the path of the damaged dreadnought, who didn't even slow down and stomped on his chest, crushing it underfoot. For the Emperor! The crippled human cackled like a maniac as he ran straight at the Farseer. Taldir drew her own sword, and in one smooth motion pointed it at the charging machine, channeling sorcerous energies through it. The moment its needle-sharp point came to a level with the small vision slit on the machine, she would unleash the energy and properly scrap it this time. She was a heartbeat from doing it when a group of freshly awoken immortals appeared between her and her target. Taldir unleashed her attack anyway, even as she dove away to avoid the onslaught she knew it was coming. Her attack struck one of the Illuviar soldiers in the shoulder, the warp energies proving just potent enough to sever the joint before a burst of emerald cracked over the machine and dissipated the rest. That immortal let go of his heavy weapon and retrieved a carbine from an attachment on his back. The 5 others wasted no time in blasting at the Farseer with their Tesla cannons. Taldir threw a psychic shield between her lithe form and the attackers, created a few illusions to help her better evade their attention, and dashed towards the closest building. She was confident that she could take on the Necron Lord by herself, or could dispatch those walking horrors. Fighting them all together, she would need to cull down some of the humans around, rally her warriors, and then decisively end this nonsense. The damned Necron had other ideas. He brute-forced his way through her illusions and jumped to engage her in close combat, while his reinforcements marched their way. Taldir danced around the monster, pitted her mastery over the great ocean against the Illuviar terrible technology, yet she simply couldn't get the upper hand. Every time she saw an opening and was about to take advantage of it utilizing her superior mobility, the Immortals fired at her, forcing her to evade. Sadly, the engagement wasn't going much better for her warriors. Oh, they were spilling rivers of Mon-Ki blood. Taldir could both see it and sense it. Dozens of the parasites died all around her with each passing second, yet more and more of the monkeys poured in from the surrounding areas. Worse, good Eldar warriors were falling as well, brought low by the crude implements wielded by the Mon-Ki. As if that wasn't bad enough, there was something wrong nearby that made her skin crawl worse than the few unfortunate encounters she had with the Neverborn. Part 4. Victory Bay, Kronus. Sergeant Forcus followed the Angel of Death to his best ability, determined not to face the Xeno alone. He wasn't going to say it aloud no matter what, but having a large, very dangerous target beside him sounded like a good way to divert the enemy's attention and keep breathing for longer. Perhaps long enough so the Imperial forces could put down the aliens for good. Following the Astartes was easier said than done. The giant of a man tore through walls, shattered the floor to make a path, a few times blasted through the ceiling with his bolter before jumping up in an impossible feat of strength and agility, given the apparent bulk and height of his armor. He left a trail of bloody and dying Eldar in his way too, and Gabriel was more than happy to ensure that the Xeno were dead for good. All good things had to come to an end. Without any warning, the Astartes sprinter forward ran through a wall after weakening it with a burst of bolter fire, and before the debris had finished falling, he crossed the room beyond and jumped through the shattered ruin of a shot-up window. Forcus cursed and ran after the overgrown maniac before some sneaky alien decided he would make for a good target to pick up. The Space Marine landed between a pair of those screaming bitches and engaged them with bolter and knife that was a full-size sword for a normal human. The avenue outside was a scene of utter carnage, with Imperial soldiers and those metal Xenos fighting the Eldar. There was fire and blood everywhere, and the screaming of the dying. Gabriel shuddered, but didn't let his fear and revulsion slow him down. He aimed and opened fire at the Banshees, counting that any stray shots won't do more than inconvenience the Angel of Death. A sleek alien fighter roared overhead, chased by Imperial interceptors that struggled to keep up with it. A crack of blinding lighting and buffering wave of displaced air heralded the arrival of enemy reinforcements. More Eldar craft streaked through the sky, this time pursued both by Imperial and Necron machines. There was no mistaking those crescent-shaped monsters for anything else. Of more immediate concern was the reinforcements the Eldar brought to bear. Suddenly, the Emperor-damned bloody battle turned into pure slaughter for everyone involved. The fresh Eldar threw themselves in the fight with a relish, preventing their friends' form being properly overran and trampled under the boots and threads of the guard. Fortunately, the Imperial reserves were nearby as well, and a whole PDF infantry regiment threw itself into the fray, pouring countless bodies into the slaughter. The streets ran red with human and alien blood. Forcus saw whole squads die under the guns and blades of the Eldar, some shot, other cut and torn apart, burned, melted and blown up. Then there was the abominable heretical sorcery the Xeno wielded, doing terrible things to behold to those it struck. Gabriel kept firing, pausing only to reload or throw the odd grenade into the fray. He had to displace twice when Eldar marked his position, yet they were distracted by his fellow guardsmen and women, giving him barely enough time to get out of his position before a plasma grenade turned one into inferno and the second became so much kindling thanks to rapid-fire projectile weaponry. The sergeant didn't survive intact. His thick carapace armor turned away glancing hits, cracking in the process, and in 2 cases it barely held shots that passed through walls to touch him. He even felt a rib shatter, or perhaps that was the armor plate. It hurt like hell anyway, it was getting harder to breathe, but at least he wasn't coughing blood, and that was something, right? Many humans and Xeno alike below were less fortunate. The abattoir there was complete. Laser guns, multi-lasers, melter, plasma, bolters, even the threads of chimeras and a tank platoon that just arrived to provide close support to the bloody infantry. Nothing should have been able to stand against such a display of human might. Yet the Eldar refused to break. They threw themselves with suicidal Abaddon at the guard, determined to slaughter as many humans as they possibly could before superior numbers and firepower buried them, sometimes literally. Gabriel knew war. He had faced both Orcs and Tau before, but this was something else. Why didn't the knife-eared freaks break and run? That way at least a few of them might make it out, and any of his buddies still alive in this slaughterhouse might yet survive. Forcus kept shooting, and without thinking began screaming his hatred at the Xeno who kept killing everyone in sight. I don't know how long it took me to get back my faculties, but it couldn't have been that long, because the fighting was still going on around us, and we were still alive. On the bright side, now there are more and more guardsmen streaming into the avenue, and they brought armored support, sentinels that stood as far away from the Eldar and shot at them with heavy stubbers, multi-lasers and lance cannons. Chimeras with similar armament as well, which was sturdy enough to provide some cover from certain Eldar weapons. Another positive was that the freak that tried to shoot me in the back was now well and truly dead. There was an Astartes towering above his body, and the Space Marine's foot had smashed through the Eldar's skull, with the boot still in place, caked in blood and brains, while its owner kept shooting down range. "Inquisitor, are you all right?" A deep voice boomed loud enough to hear over the roar of the battle. "I'll live," I shouted back and tried to get up. My brain immediately protested, and it didn't help that I had gained a limpet. The little girl now clung to my side, empty eyes staring at nothing in particular, and refused to let go. Either she was surprisingly strong, or I was more messed up than I thought I was, because when I tried, I miserably failed to pry her away without hurting her. It took a guardsman who had his right arm hanging limply, helping me get up, girl attached to my side and all. "What's the situation?" I demanded from no one in particular. "The bastards are dying hard, Inquisitor." A young commissar, hell, the boy looked younger than me, thundered form nearby. When I saw him, he was busy dragging back a screaming guardsman who had his guts shout to hell. "Commissar Charles Weber at your service, sir." He flourished his bloody chainsword in my direction, shoved the wounded bastard at a medicae, and drew his bolt pistol. "Orders? Do we continue charging the bastards and trying our best to stick them with the pointy end, or do you have something fancy in mind?" "She's a blank," I shouted back. "We can use her to shut down any Xeno sorcery by bringing her close to the bloody bastards. We just need to keep her in one piece." "Ah, so we would only worry about being shot and cut open." The commissar nodded happily. "I can work with that. Jones, push the chimeras ahead and get me 2 squads of your biggest, toughest bastards to act as bodyguards. And someone help me put her down without breaking her fingers," I added. "You intend to lead from the front like you did against that orc?" Weber exclaimed, excitement coloring his voice. "That was awesome. You're truly a credit to the Inquisition and humanity as a whole, sir. We'll be right beside you, won't we, boys and girls?" The nearby troops cheered gleefully, though not a single one of them capable of fighting even slowed down firing at any and all Eldar in sight. What the hell did I just volunteer for? Chapter 5, Parts 5 and 6. Chapter 5, The Battle of Victory Bay. Part 5, Victory Bay, Kronus. "For the Emperor, at them no mercy." A Vox-enhanced voice thundered above the battlefield, and thousands, tens of thousands, took up the war cry, their fury shaking the very foundation of the building Gabriel fought from. "For the Emperor." A deep, resonating bass came from below, proving that the shaking came from someone fighting on the lower floors. The floor danced below Forker's feet, making him stumble. A deafening crash and cracking energy could be heard from below. Then another one, and a huge red figure exploded on the avenue, waving around a thunderhammer. Gabriel shook himself up and continued to fight. Finally, he could see and sense it. The tide was turning. The guardsmen below were swarming forwards, racing on the heels of sentinels and chimeras that came down from the far end of the avenue, with a trio of Lehman Russ tanks and their infantry support slowly moving to join them. The sergeant spared a few precious moments to take in the sight, especially when he saw a familiar figure among those leading the charge. There, flanked by a command squad and the distinctive shape of a commissar, was the Inquisitor who became famous by first reining in the Blood Ravens and then going after the Orc warboss himself, charging that ugly abomination like a hero from legend. He even got away with it, and here he was, leading another charge to break the enemies of humanity. "The Emperor protects," Gabriel screamed at the top of his lungs, suddenly feeling ashamed that he had been skulking around taking potshots instead of being even more active in the fighting. He wasn't proud at all of the thoughts he had while following that space marine and using that hero as a distraction so the enemy wouldn't come after him first. For the Emperor. No mercy. Kill the Xeno. More and more war cries echoed through the battlefield. The Imperial war machine chugged along nicely, and now that it was up to speed, there was no stopping it. Eldar tried their favorite hit-and-run tactics. However, there wasn't much space to run into that wasn't already crawling with squads of guardsmen with blood in their eyes. A xenocraft came screeching from above the ruins of the command center and began strafing the avenue, heedless that some of its own people were fighting and dying down there. Imperial fighters were hot on its heels. However, even to Forcus's untrained eye in things aeronautic, they were losing ground. Lasfire rose to meet the coming Deathbringer for all the good it did. Gabriel aided his own meager firepower at the onslaught. However, the Eldar fighter continued unabated, and it appeared it was aiming straight at the Inquisitor, the never-sufficiently damned bastard. Green lighting cracked at 2 locations below, and a lone figure appeared between the approaching death from above and the advancing Imperial forces. It was a large Xeno, one of the Necron allies, who had to be some kind of leader. Its whole body and regalia was more ornamental compared to the few other of its kind Gabriel had the misfortune of seeing so far. It rose its staff at the fighter and unleashed a single beam of green light and shook it left and right, following the Eldar craft. The fighter released a spread of missiles before promptly blowing up, and with a bit of luck, it would take out the other Xeno for good measure. The Necron Lord grew more and more frustrated with every passing second. The elusive Farseer continued to evade his strikes. The Eldari managed to bring some reinforcements as well, which was a mixed blessing. While that meant crushing them in this location and eliminating their leader became much harder, those troops weren't somewhere else wreaking havoc against the Imperial mobile assets, which would be vital in winning the larger battle, not just the ongoing skirmish in the middle of the city. Nevertheless, it was immensely frustrating, especially once he lost the support of his first immortal squad to awake and enter the fray. While he couldn't get a solid hit upon the Farseer, she did manage to strike his metal hide a few times, leaving slowly healing scars behind. At least the damage he had suffered so far hadn't impaired his combat capabilities. The same couldn't be said for too many of his available units. While they did their job, too many troopers, warriors, and even destroyers were damaged if not outright destroyed while clashing with Eldar raiding parties. That was less than ideal, considering that the primary clash was yet to occur, with the Tau just piercing the Imperial outer defenses. It didn't help that the Necron Lord found himself drawing reinforcements from the force he had been carefully gathering in order to strike the Tau from behind, once they committed themselves so they could be broken in the field for good. It wasn't all bad. While the humans proved inferior individually to the Eldari as expected, there were a lot of them, and they didn't flinch from throwing themselves at the enemy and paid the price for victory. They were already rallying in large numbers, and soon they would have the critical mass to ensure this skirmish would be brought to a decisive end. That much was clear to the Necron Lord, and he wondered if the Farseer could foresee how doomed her efforts were. Well, apparently she did, and in response, she called air support. While the human aircraft were decently armored, given their apparent technological level anyway, well armed as well, they were damn slow and ponderous, something that the Eldari exploited ruthlessly. If it wasn't for a couple of squadrons of doom scythes he was able to get operational just in case, the Tau and Eldar would have had uncontested control of the air, with predicable disastrous consequences. Not a single one of them was in a position to intercept the incoming enemy air support, and the Eldar fighter wasn't aiming at the Necron Lord, which gave him a tiny pause once he figured that out. It was coming at the wrong angle, and he was already engaged with the Farseer in close combat. He would be able to better weather any heavy weapons strikes than the Witch. Using the sensors of cloaked scarabs and his active units in the area, it immediately became clear what the target was. The humans had just rallied and advanced rapidly this way. One of their leaders, the Inquisitor, led them, and his death at the hands of aliens might be perilous for the Alliance. From what little the Lord could gather, said human was uncommonly reasonable for someone of his station, which, thinking about it, was another reason for the Farseer to want him dead on general principle. It took him a split second to weight the probabilities and decision made. The Necron Lord disengaged, using a power surge to overload his phasing systems and teleport in a better position to intercept the incoming craft. He channeled the excess energy into a makeshift defensive screen, even as he fed as much power as he could through his staff and released it as a beam at the coming fighter. His aim was true, and the offensive machine blew up in an impressive display of pyrotechnics, but not before it launched a spread of missiles at the Necron. He braced himself and pumped all available energy in protecting himself before plasma warheads turned the immediate area into slice of hell. Even as his systems struggled to compensate for the immense heat and he walked out of the inferno with the outer layer of his plating melting, the Necron Lord could see that the Eldari gambit would be partially successful. The humans couldn't move fast and enforce through the raging fire. Only their sealed combat vehicles could brave the impacted area by moving through its outer edges. While that would doom any Eldar behind him, those on the other side of the fire would have a small window of opportunity to disengage, disperse, and try and run for it. That was unacceptable. The Necron Lord called more reinforcements to hunt down the old enemy, despite doing so, meaning that neutralizing the Tau would be slower and bloodier for everyone involved. Allowing the too many Eldar to survive would mean that they would be available to cause havoc on the supply lines and other soft targets, while the Allies had their attention focused at greater threats. 2 surviving immortal soldiers joined him, falling a step behind once the Necron Lord walked out of the inferno. "What is your command?" The senior one, the equivalent of a human sergeant, asked, both through the secure communication network and aloud, demonstrating that his voice caster was very much all right. "Hunt down the Eldar," he sent back. Part 6, Imperial Command Center, Victory Bay. In just a few short hours, General Alexander found himself hating the Necrons. It wasn't simply because they were Xenos, and thus loathing them with a passion was its own reward, as the priests often proclaimed. Surprisingly enough, they were yet to prove how treacherous they were, and instead the Necrons were apparently going out of their way to be accommodating, and with the exception of their voice, did go to some lengths to try and be as unoffensive as possible, which was admittedly a tall order for the metal monsters. The root of his hatred was simple and perhaps even heretical. Lucas Alexander was envious. It was becoming increasingly clear that the Xeno Lord didn't lie and its troops were crippled. Yet despite all that, what they could offer and display was frightening. First and most obvious, it was the enemy's Auspex equivalents combined with their stealth metal insects, which offered crystal-clear real-time intelligence of the enemy's movement. That information was precious commodity at the best of times and against the Eldar. Seeing where they gathered and how they infiltrated the Imperial lines was invaluable in order to prepare the various ambushes and units that were about to be struck. Next came the natural way the Necrons combined their various forces, which was a hard thing to do for the Imperial Guard by design. There was precious little infantry in armor regiments, no tanks to speak of in mechanized ones, and the poor bloody infantry, well, it was up to them to do and die, as that ancient saying went. The Necrons and the fucking Tau of all people, they demonstrated how effective integrated combined arms approach was when available. Alexander fumed inside because the Guard couldn't have the same as a matter of course because of the risk of making any traitor forces that much more dangerous. Even 10,000 years later, the Empire was yet to heal from the scars from the Great Heresy. The less said about how much better the Necron weapons were than what everyone else handed to the rank and file, the better. The way the Mechanicus adepts attached to his forces acted clearly showed how much better those things were, and how much some of them wanted to get their mechanical appendages on them, while others were up in arms at that perceived heresy. When the battle began, Alexander received another reason to loathe the Necrons, especially their leader. The self-proclaimed Nameless Lord took the field personally and engaged the Eldar Farseer responsible for the current mess. Yet the fact was that while the Necron Lord was currently fighting one of the most dangerous individuals on the planet, perhaps even the sector, he was also simultaneously commanding and controlling his deployed forces. That much was evident thanks to displays on Hololith collecting data from hordes of servo skulls and a crystal-clear map projected by a Necron scarab that silently floated nearby. The final reason to loathe the Xeno up to his dying day, Alexander found in the revelation that without this unholy alliance, he would have been unlikely to hold Victory Bay. There were too many Eldar, they were extremely dangerous, and by the time the Tau broke through the primary defense lines, the blue aliens would have faced only scattered remnants of Imperial mobile forces. Even now, when his troops were forewarned, prepared, and had the Necrons fighting beside them, the reserve and mobile formations were taking a beating, not enough to break them, not enough to ensure the Tau could roll over them, yet. General Alexander grit his teeth. If the Eldar had taken them by surprise, they would have slaughtered his people in more than enough numbers to ensure the Tau would finish the job before fading away. Well, instead the knife-ears were too busy fighting a real war and dying. Unfortunately, they were dying hard, the bastards, and taking too many of his troops with them. Lucas wanted to turn his full might upon the Eldar, yet he couldn't. Their armor was already through the defensive lines with Bloodraven assets under the personal command of Davian Thula moving to intercept, and the Tau would still achieve and exploit the breakthrough they desired, and once committed would sign their death sentences. Alexander had no intention of letting them escape and thus prove a credible threat at a time when he had to focus his undivided attention upon the traitors. The command center was full with chatter from the various Imperial forces fighting all over the region, and too many of them were final transmissions of forces being overrun or turned combat ineffective. That was a large issue among the PDF regiments deployed throughout the city, who were suffering the brunt of the Eldar wrath. The same was true for the doomed bastards who found themselves in the way of the Tau advance. 5 regiments stood their ground, and 4 of them were already destroyed, with the 5th. Kroot, we're being overrun by Kroot. Final defensive fire on my position, Ave Imperator. Enemy crisis suits have us pinned down. We need artillery support. We lost contact with all friendly forces on our flanks. Tau units are about to encircle us. This is Commissar Nora. The Colonel is dead. Vespids raided the HQ. I'm taking command. Hold your ground in the name of the Emperor. Shoot it. Shoot it down now. They got the Commissar. Kill them all. This is Sergeant Yuma. The Colonel and Commissar are dead. All other officers have fallen as well. Half the regiment is already gone and we're being overrun. All available artillery, fire for effect on my position. It is target-rich environment. Ave Imperator and have a nice war. 5th Kronus Planetary Defense Regiment, signing off. And after that transmission, only silence came from the Imperial regiments between the 2 points of the breach in the defensive lines. It took 3 more minutes for the Necron display to turn that zone fully red, showing that there were still guardsmen over there fighting to the last, and dying after contact was lost. The Tau were going to pay for this, their Eldar masters as well, if Alexander had any say in it. If he had to, he was going to chase Taldir to the depths of the warp and back so he could put that cursed witch down himself. Very soon, we'll have them where we want them. The Necron envoy broke the relative silence that followed the death of 5 whole regiments. According to the map, what was left of Alexander's armored regiments would be still very much out of position, and would be forced to engage the Tau mobile formation that favored the enemy's hovercraft. With the artillery more often than not suppressed or moving to avoid being destroyed by the enemy equivalent, the situation appeared grim. Yet much of the artillery park was still largely intact, and whole regiments were almost in position to launch attacks in overwhelming numbers upon the Eldar raiders who were still alive. Once those pests were neutralized, the Guard and PDF units tasked with killing the Eldar would move to reinforce the defensive lines and the armored regiments. At the same time, the Necron's heavy units would enter the fray, forming the hammer that would shatter the Tau with the Guard forming the anvil. 10 minutes for the enemy to be in position, then another 5 for them to engage fully, Alexander summarized. At that point, we'll be hitting the Eldar with everything we have and should have overwhelmed the majority of their deployed units. That was the plan anyway. It remained to be seen how little in common it would have with the cold, hard reality. Chapter 5, Parts 7 and 8. Chapter 5, The Battle of Victory Bay. Part 7. While multiple armies fought for control of Kronus, calls for reinforcements raced throughout the galaxy. Captured records reveal that arguably, first to arrive was the call for help issued by Farseer Taldir. However, to her chagrin, Biel-Tan lacked available assets to dispatch to assist her without compromising the security of their craft world. At the time, Biel-Tan had been confirmed as engaged in multiple campaigns and raid across 8 different sectors. Second and third to reach their destinations were the messages sent by Captain Davian Thula and General Lucas Alexander. Those contained both calls for reinforcements, considering the greater Xeno and traitor opposition faced on Kronus, as well as clarification of orders issued to the 2 Imperial contingents that put them in direct opposition of each other. The content of those messages gained the attention of Sector and Segmentum Munitorum and Naval Command, as well as multiple Inquisitors. 2 Inquisitors raced towards Kronus to investigate, backed by elements of the Sector fleet and 8 Guard regiments available as quick reaction force. The Tau leadership planetside had already called for help long before the various armies that fought for Kronus arrived or made their presence known. The arrival of General Alexander in system prompted them to scream for assistance, and they were lucky that a Tau battle fleet carrying Commander Kai's has been close enough to respond. The Necrons were perhaps the last army to manifest on Kronus. Once their leader figured out the situation and the crippled state of his assets, he sent an open call for help to any and all Necron forces that could come to his aid. Tenuous Alliances, the Kronus Campaign, by Colonel Tonev, retired. Bridge, rogue trader vessel Luca Foedis. It wasn't often that Amberly Vale carried herself as the experienced Inquisitor she was. Usually, it was much easier and fun to live as the mask of a whimsical young woman she preferred to show the world at large. Then there were moments when doing so would be decidedly out of place. In the span of a few short hours, Segmentum Command and various inquisitorial assets in the region received 3 astropathic messages concerning Kronus, a mostly forgotten civilized world in Sector Lithesh, as Mott helpfully explained. 2 of those messages, while concerning, weren't too surprising. There were always places where multiple interests clashed, both Xeno and Imperial alike. Seeing all major enemies of humanity descent on a single world's fighting for control, it happened often enough, given the sheer size of the Imperium. Now, the Imperial forces planetside shooting at each other, not due to heresy or treason, but because of conflicting orders. That has been happening lately, and the Inquisitors within the whole Segmentum had standing orders to investigate and get to the bottom of it. That fact by itself would have gained Amberly's interest, and the presence of 5 Xeno armies on Kronus was like a siren song for an Ordo Xenos Inquisitor calling her there ASAP. It was the 3rd message, which in fact arrived first, that had her concerned. She was to make best possible speed to Kronus after gathering available quick reaction forces. She was to secure the planet and quietly investigate what the Blood Ravens were seeking down there. It came through the usual channels. It had the proper authorizations marking it as genuine and priority order. However, it lacked a clear header explaining who actually sent it. Amberly smelled politics on this one, or worse, which was never a good thing. People on the sharp end like her tended to die as a collateral damage due to such games. Still, she had her orders, and as if not more importantly, she had a mystery on her hands to solve. How long until we're ready to depart, Captain? Vale addressed the lord and master of her preferred transport, the rogue trader Aurelius. He was a middle-aged man who had a youthful appearance thanks to his access to the proper rejuvenation treatments, paid in no small part thanks to his richly rewarded service under Amberley in particular and the Inquisition in general. 6 hours until we're fully resupplied and have the Guard Regiment in place. 3 more hours for the Navy Task Force to assemble, 5 for the transports to be fully loaded and ready to break orbit. 72 hours to reach a safe distance for warp transition. That's too long. We're leaving once your ship is ready. The task force will have to follow us at the best possible speed. Stasis chambers. Necron tomb complex. Pyria. He dreamed of warm sun bathing his face, of cool wind's touch upon his skin, a lovely enticing voice calling for him. He lost himself in half-forgotten echoes of the good life he lived before the war. Then the dreams turned into nightmares of shattered worlds, enemy armadas that blotted the stars themselves, of the Great Fall, the defeat that brought all surviving Necrothire back to the all-but-forgotten homeworld, where they were either left to rot on the surface or, if lucky, to die stuck in stasis faults within the merchant ships in orbit. He remembered the Citan, the fury of his people's leaders at being brought so low, the Silent King's own boundless rage at losing his empire. He remembered the deal, remembered his own thirst of vengeance. He remembered the process, how he lost something as he walked into the great machine that stripped his flesh and soul away. He remembered the gifts of the Citan, the massive war machine the newly minted Necrons built, their thirst of vengeance that even the biotransference couldn't drown. He remembered the war that followed, could still savor the despair of the old ones. He dreamed of their madness, of the Eldar, Krork, the abominations they unleashed during their final fall. He remembered the great betrayer when Necron turned upon Necron, when they shattered the few surviving Citan. He remembered how low his people fell. Again and again, those dreams plagued him for eternity. Then he awoke and wasn't sure if it was a dream, another nightmare, or the real thing. Status displays came to life, internal diagnostic tools activated, then a query came from the outside demanding to know his status. Anrakir finally awoke, still feeling the brush of soft lips on his cheek, something he hadn't experienced for eternity even before the Great Sleep. For a moment he stood frozen in place, trying to better recall the memory. Or was it a dream? The diagnostics completed themselves, showing that he was in a surprisingly good shape, all things considered. Over 60 million years, he exclaimed aloud, once his internal systems synchronized with those under control of the caretaker intelligence responsible for the tomb world during the Great Sleep. Affirmative. Priority alert available. Request for all available support. Anrakir paid no attention to the worlds and accessed the raw data. He was pleased to find out that the complex was in a great shape, especially considering it has been left to rot for an eternity, and immediately figured out that he had been very lucky. Either that, or his counterpart had been extremely unlucky. A compromised and decayed tomb world beset by multiple lesser species, the Aeldari, who were somehow still around the bastards, and to top it all, there were abominations and their worshippers running around. That place just begged for proper purging, and the local Necron lord was planning to ally himself with one of the lesser species there in order to survive. That was only going to end well. Do we have squatters on the surface as well, and what's the status of our forces? The Necron lord asked aloud. The galaxy had obviously went to ruin without proper overlords keeping things together, something that simply had to be addressed. Gaining the allegiance of the surviving forces upon that tomb world, not to mention actionable intelligence about potential threats and the overall status of the galaxy, would be a good first step before establishing a firm plan for the future, the Necron concluded. He received a data file from the caretaker intelligence which confirmed that there was a lesser presence on the surface, though they weren't exactly squatters. Some kind of fluffy little local critter had evolved into a lesser species that was busy trying to figure proper farming. His late wife might have liked them or not. It has been so long she has been gone, murdered during the war between the Necrothire and the Old Ones, that these days Anrakir had trouble properly remembering her. Deeming the locals of no interest, he turned his attention towards the status of his troops. Part 8. Victory Bay outskirts. Kronus. Lieutenant Astra loved her lighting interceptor, she really did. That adamantite-clad fact did nothing to make her dearly wish she and her comrades were flying better, much better machines. Both their supposed allies and the murderous Eldar had fighters that totally outclassed anything the Empire could put in the skies of Kronus. 15 minutes of fighting saw multiple Imperial squadrons decimated for little to no gain. The enemy was faster, more maneuverable, had better acceleration, and worst of all, the Auspex couldn't see the real target through the countermeasures broadcasted by the Eldar. That simple fact made missiles useless and forced the Imperial pilots to close in for dogfighting, precisely the wrong thing to do when facing the Eldar. As if to rub copious amounts of salt into the raw wounds, the only reason there were any Imperial aircraft in the air were their allies, who flew wicked armored tanks that turned on a dime and packed a whole squadron's worth of firepower. The Xeno aid was very cold comfort for all too many Imperial pilots, including everyone else in Erica's original squadron. During the fight above Victory Bay, she had to assume command of the shattered remains of multiple squadrons, only to watch and hear them die one after another, while they desperately tried to keep the enemy from blowing up the city below them. Considering how the day had been going, Erica really shouldn't have been surprised at what happened next. "Behind us," Lieutenant Vitae shouted from the back seat. With the Auspex being next to useless, his primary job was to look all around and warn her when an enemy went after them from behind. "Hold on," Astra hissed and threw the lighting into a dive. The interceptor shook from near misses while she tried to find an operational AA battery to drive at, which would hopefully dissuade the Eldar pilot for pursuing her. She managed to splash one enemy fighter by baiting its pilot into a wall of AA fire that merely dinged her armored fighter but shredded the light Xeno craft. This time, she couldn't see a single conveniently set up AA position, damn it. The lighting screeched and shook, its controls buckled in Arya's hands. However, she managed to retain control, if barely. "We're hit," Vitae exclaimed, as if Erica didn't notice. "We just lost some armor, I think." "Why are we still alive?" Astra wondered aloud, while her head snapped every which way searching for the Eldar fighter. A moment later she saw it overtaking the lighting in a steep climb, trying to evade solid emerald beams. It managed to avoid 3 bursts, then a 4th, though the 5th scored a solid hit on the belly of the sleek fighter, which promptly vanished in a green-tinted fireball. "Sweet merciful Emperor," Vitae muttered, as a huge Necron fighter flew past the lighting, shook its single crescent-shaped wing at them, made victory roll in full display, and only then it boosted away in search for more targets. Erica was sure she would never live it down, being saved by filthy Xeno. Either that, or the fact that the damned aliens had better fighters, the bloody lucky bastards. As it turned out, Lieutenant Astra might not have to live it down after all. Broadsword 1-1. Crown Actual, I've got another tasking for you. We have a single operational bomber squadron remaining. You're to assume command of our remaining air assets in the area and escort them in for a strike on the advancing Tau armor. Don't worry about the Eldar, they're beginning to disengage and our allies will continue to harass their air power. Just concentrate on escorting those bombers in. That was easier said than done, much easier. However, Erica wasn't ready to backtalk the general militant in charge of all Imperial forces on Kronus. Flying in the face of the Tau's air defenses might be survivable, a firing squad or worse for disobeying order and showing cowardice in the face of the enemy. Not so much. Crown Actual, Broadsword 1-1, escort in a ground strike aye. We'll do our best and then some. Broadsword 1-1 out. "Well, it was nice knowing you, LT," Erica's Auspex officer interjected. Scanners are clearing up. The Eldar might actually be pulling back." "That still leaves the Tau, Marek. Broadsword 1-1 to all Aeronautica elements receiving this. Form up on me above our airfields. We've got a tasking from up high." It wasn't until then that Erica could afford to pay any real attention to the city below, and the reports she could glean about the situation on the ground. There were dozens, if not hundreds of fires blazing all over Victory Bay. Flashes of green, red and white explosions lit it up, though the fighting was apparently dying down. The same couldn't be said for the outskirts. Astra flew high enough to see flashes of explosions and energy weapons all over the place, signifying heavy fighting. Broadsword 1-1, Thunder 1-1, I'm glad you're still around. New markers appeared on Erica's Auspex screen, showing 6 fat and slow Marauder bombers, no doubt loaded to the brims with ordnance. If there were any Eldar left to intercept them, Lieutenant Astra knew that those machines and their crews would be dead meat. Thunder 1-1, Broadsword 1-1, the pleasure is mutual. We'll keep any pests away from you. Do we have a tasking? Broadsword 1-1, Thunder 1-1, transmitting target coordinates now. Be advised, we've got confirmation about Tau fighters in the area harassing our tank regiments. Of course they are, Erica muttered. Only 12 interceptors converged to provide escort, a far cry from the 120-strong air wing that rose to meet the Eldar just a few minutes ago. Damned Xenos. Storm Guard actual to all storm elements, we've got the Xeno where we want them. We've got an airstrike inbound to soften them up, and the artillery is finally set up and secure. With saturation barrages on the way, all units, you're free to maneuver independently. The counterattack behind after the first artillery barrage is complete, ETA 69 seconds and counting. Colonel Fahid Roval spoke proudly into the Vox. We've done a good thing today, and we're about to do something even greater. I'm proud of every single one of you. He was in overall command of all armored regiments the Guard had on Kronus, or at least what was left of them. He lost a lot of tanks and personnel during the fight with the Orcs and consequent Tau treachery. However, a lot of the hardware abandoned in the field would be recoverable if he won this battle. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said about his crews, and drawing people from the other regiments would be merely a stopgap measure, one that would hurt future performance. Just not as much as not leaving any recovered tanks back in the depot without crew. However, those were ruminations for the future. He first had to win this battle. Venerable Lehman Russ tanks made the core of his force, which he used from dug-in positions to maximize their defensive advantages. He was lucky that his tanks were manufactured on proper forge words and were built up to spec, complete with all the advanced gear that they were supposed to have. Otherwise, the good old Russ would have been dead meat facing Tau armor in anything resembling realistic conditions. Even better, he had a relatively large contingent of tank killers brought in case they faced Eldar armor, which ironically wasn't his problem. The Astartes were dealing with that monumental headache to the south. Missiles, railgun slugs and plasma rained all over the dug-in Imperial forces, and they responded in kind with direct fire, the few precious MLRs and other integrated artillery assets that General Alexander allowed him to control for this engagement. The command vehicle shook from a near miss. Roval could see tanks from both sides die, thanks to direct feed provided by servo skulls, and a few Necron equivalents skulking around. Most importantly, he could see that the Necron armor was moving fast too. By the time the artillery struck and the Aeronautica was in position to rain hell upon the Tau, the blue bastards would find their escape road slammed shut behind them. Then they were going to die. Roval had precise orders. The Tau had to be destroyed as a field force today, and the colonel was eagerly anticipating doing precisely that after what those blue freaks did to his regiment. Hundreds of shells screamed overhead, and Colonel Roval smiled a terrible smile. The ground shook with fire and thunder, the world doing its best to end through the intense bombardment. Storm Guard actual to all Storm Guard elements, attack. Show no mercy, offer no quarter, kill them all, for the Emperor.